Manhattan, New York. 2:47 p.m. Saturday, April 13th, 1935. The spring rain on East 116th Street fell in fat, lazy drops that turned the sidewalk into a mirror, reflecting the neon signs of policy shops and speakeasies. The air carried the smell of wet concrete, fried fish from corner diners, and the metallic scent of money changing hands in back-alley dice games. Outside Minton's Playhouse, two men stood under the narrow awning, their expensive overcoats already darkening with moisture. One of them was Vincent Mad Dog Cole's former lieutenant, a thick-necked Italian enforcer named Anthony Big Tony Strollo, recently transferred to work Harlem operations under Dutch Schultz's rapidly crumbling empire. His pinstriped suit cost more than most Harlem families earned in 3 months. His gold watch caught what little sunlight penetrated the clouds. His arrogance was about to cost him everything. The other man was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy stood 6 feet tall in a charcoal wool suit that fit him like it was tailored by angels. His fedora sat at the precise angle that said he owned the block, the neighborhood, and anyone foolish enough to test that assumption. He had been summoned to this meeting by Strollo's people, told it was about reorganizing certain business arrangements in Harlem. What it actually was, Bumpy realized within the first 30 seconds, was an attempt at public humiliation designed to establish dominance. Strollo didn't speak to Bumpy as a fellow businessman. He spoke to him as a problem to be solved. He slid a crumpled envelope across the wet newspaper stand between them, an offer to buy out Bumpy's entire numbers operation for less than a single day's profit. The insult was mathematical. Then he made it personal. "Listen here, boy," Strollo said, loud enough for the shoeshine kid across the street to hear, loud enough for the women walking past with their groceries to turn and stare. "You colored boys had your fun playing gangster, but the real men are taking over now. You can take this money and disappear, or you can stay and find out what happens to who don't know their place." The word hung in the air like a loaded gun. Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch, didn't reach for the .38 special everyone knew he carried, didn't raise his voice or clench his fists. He simply picked up the envelope, opened it with deliberate precision, counted the bills inside, and placed them back on the newspaper stand. The silence stretched for 43 seconds. Witnesses would later count. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice was so calm it sounded like a judge reading a sentence. "You have until midnight tomorrow," he said quietly, "to leave Harlem. Take your money, take your men, and take that word out of your mouth before I take your tongue out of your head." Strollo laughed. Too loud. Too nervous. "Or what? You'll call your African witch doctor friends? This is white man's business now, Bumpy. Time you learned that." Bumpy adjusted his hat, turned his back on Strollo, and walked away without another word. His footsteps echoed off the wet pavement with the rhythm of a funeral march. At 2:52 p.m., Strollo was still laughing. By 11:47 p.m., the next day Anthony Big Tony Strollo would be found in the trunk of his own Cadillac, parked outside a police station in Brooklyn, very much alive but missing 3 fingers and his gold watch. Pinned to his chest with a brass safety pin would be a single playing card, the King of Spades, and a note written in perfect penmanship, "Harlem belongs to Harlem." But the real story wasn't the revenge. The real story was what happened at 3:15 p.m. That same afternoon, when Bumpy Johnson walked into a Brooklyn social club and sat across from Charles Lucky Luciano to discuss a deal that would make him the only black man in America the Italian mob couldn't touch. The story of how Anthony Strollo lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to April 13th, 1935. Manhattan, New York, 1935. The city breathed differently now. Prohibition had been buried for 2 years, but its ghost still haunted every corner where money changed hands in darkness. The speakeasies had ripped down their false walls and hidden doors, transforming overnight into legitimate nightclubs. But the men who built empires in those shadows had no intention of going straight. They evolved. What used to be street gangs with sawed-off shotguns and territorial pissing contests had become a corporate structure built on silence, precision, and systematic violence. Charles Lucky Luciano had killed the old world and replaced it with something infinitely more dangerous, organized crime that was actually organized. The traditional mafia had operated like feudal kingdoms. One boss at the top, everyone else scrambling beneath him, every perceived slight answered with bullets and bodies bleeding out in gutters. Luciano watched that chaos devour itself and decided to build something better. The Commission. 5 families operating not as warring tribes, but as a board of directors. Disputes settled through votes, not vendettas. Territory divided through negotiation, not massacres. Violence became surgical, purposeful, never wasteful. When someone had to die, it was a business decision, not a tantrum. From his windowless office in Lower Manhattan, Luciano managed this machine like a Fortune 500 executive. The waterfront, garment district, construction unions, loan sharking, bookmaking operations, all flowing through well-organized channels. Every dollar accounted for, every operation measured against potential federal attention. The system generated more money than the old bosses ever dreamed possible, except for one glaring deficit in the ledger. Harlem. The numbers racket in Harlem was a $3 million per year industry. Poor man's stock market, where working people dropped dimes on dreams, playing birthdays, addresses, license plates. Pennies and nickels that, multiplied by tens of thousands of players daily, became rivers of untaxed cash. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Harlem represented 30% of Manhattan's illegal gambling revenue. 30%. Nearly a third of the action happening inside Luciano's own territory. And he didn't control it. The problem wasn't lack of ambition. It was execution. Italian crews stuck out in Harlem like bloodstains on white shirts. They couldn't blend in, couldn't build trust, couldn't operate the delicate networks that made policy running profitable. Every attempt to muscle in met the same result. The community closed ranks. Witnesses saw nothing. Informants knew nothing. Operations that should have generated thousands yielded nothing but resistance and federal attention. Dutch Schultz represented everything wrong with the old approach. The Dutchman was a blunt instrument, in an age that demanded surgical precision. He viewed Harlem as territory to be conquered through systematic brutality. His crews beat runners in alleys, firebombed policy banks, tortured anyone who resisted. Schultz believed terror would break the community's will. Instead, it made them surgical in return. Schultz's cars developed mysterious mechanical problems in the wrong neighborhoods. His collectors walked into policy spots that had been stripped bare hours before their arrival. His Harlem lieutenants disappeared or turned up too broken to continue. As his frustration escalated, so did the attention from Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey and federal agents who saw in Dutch a convenient target for headlines and indictments. Luciano studied the intelligence reports with cold detachment. Schultz was trying to break a lock that required a key. The resistance wasn't random. There was a mind behind it, organizing the community's defiance with the precision of a chess grandmaster. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The dossier revealed a criminal more sophisticated than most commission capos. Johnson wasn't just extracting money from Harlem, he was investing in it. He paid rent for struggling families, handled abusive landlords, settled disputes, protected local businesses from outside predators. In exchange, he received something money couldn't buy: absolute loyalty. The community didn't just tolerate his operations, they actively protected them because Johnson made their lives more stable, not less. This wasn't a street thug. This was management. The racial mathematics were uncomfortable but undeniable. The Italian families had never treated a black gangster as an equal partner. Subordinates? Yes. Street-level operators who paid tribute? Certainly. But never someone who sat at the table and negotiated terms. The very idea violated every tradition of the Underworld's racial hierarchy. But tradition was expensive. Prejudice was a luxury Luciano couldn't afford when 30% of the revenue remained untouchable. Meyer Lonsky entered the office carrying his own ledgers, his accountant's mind already calculating next quarter's projections. Luciano closed the file on Bumpy Johnson and tapped it once with his knuckles. The decision formed with the cold logic of pure mathematics. "Set up a meeting with Johnson," he said, quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a choice that would reshape the entire Underworld power structure. He paused, letting the implications settle like smoke in the air. "And Meyer. This one we do with respect." Ellsworth Raymond Johnson arrived in Harlem in 1919, carrying everything he owned in a cardboard suitcase held together with twine. He was 14 years old, fleeing Charleston, South Carolina, where a white man's insult had nearly cost him his life. The Great Migration brought thousands north, chasing promises that turned out to be more complicated than advertised. But Bumpy didn't chase promises. He studied patterns. The slight swelling on his skull that would earn him his nickname was called a deformity by doctors. Harlem would eventually call it a warning. By the time he reached his 20s, that thin, sharp-eyed boy from the South had learned to read power like sheet music. He watched how influence moved through the streets like electricity through copper wire, and he learned to redirect that current. Jim Crow had taught him early that the law was not written for men like him. Survival depended on strength, but victory depended on intelligence. Stephanie St. Clair found him running numbers for a 2-bit operation on 139th Street. Madam Queen, the legendary ruler of Harlem's policy racket, recognized something in the quiet teenager who never gambled, never drank, and treated the numbers business like advanced mathematics. She brought him into her organization not as muscle, but as a strategist. For 8 years, Bumpy learned the architecture of Harlem's underground economy from the only person who had built an empire without answering to any man, white or black. St. Clair taught him that the policy game wasn't merely gambling. It was the unofficial banking system of Black America. White banks wouldn't lend to Harlem residents, wouldn't insure their businesses, wouldn't touch their money. The numbers game filled that void. It was an economy within an economy. She showed him that respect purchased with investment lasted longer than fear purchased with violence. That lesson became the foundation of everything that followed. By 1935, Bumpy Johnson controlled 35 square blocks of Manhattan real estate without owning a single deed. From 110th Street to 145th, river to river, his territory wasn't marked by violence, but by systematic organization. His policy banks operated with the efficiency of legitimate businesses. His runners knew that skimming meant broken hands, but honest work meant steady pay and protection from outside predators. The numbers flowed upward through collection points, were calculated with precision, and winners received their payouts without argument or delay. Trust became currency. But the operations extended far beyond gambling. Bumpy's ledgers included line items that made no immediate financial sense. Rent payments for families facing eviction. Groceries delivered to households where the father had been arrested on manufactured charges. legal fees for residents caught in the machinery of a justice system designed to grind them down. If a grandmother on Lenox Avenue couldn't make rent, Bumpy paid it. If a landlord turned off the heat in January, Bumpy's men turned it back on and ensured the landlord understood the consequences of a second offense. When landlords refused to fix heat in winter or allowed buildings to decay into hazardous slums, those landlords received visits from men who explained the situation with brutal clarity. This investment strategy created an intelligence network that money alone could never purchase. The community learned that Bumpy Johnson's protection wasn't abstract. It was tangible, measurable, real. In exchange for his protection, Harlem became his eyes and ears. A strange car couldn't turn a corner without Bumpy knowing the license plate number before the driver parked. Which doorman drank too much? Which cop could be bought? Which had to be worked around? His network was built not on microphones and cameras, but on loyalty and fear, balanced with mathematical precision. When Dutch Schultz sent his crews into Harlem in 1933, attempting to seize the policy racket through systematic terror, he discovered that violence without information was just expensive noise. The Dutchman was a blunt instrument in an age that demanded surgical precision. He viewed Harlem as territory to be conquered through brutality. His men beat runners in allies, stormed policy houses with bats and pistols, attempted to replace decades of community relationships with direct terror. Bumpy responded with calculated guerrilla warfare. He never met force with equal force. The war against Schultz became a masterclass in asymmetric conflict. Bumpy knew which buildings Schultz's men would hit before they arrived. He knew which runners had been approached with bribes or threats. A Schultz truck carrying betting slips and cash would catch fire 2 blocks after crossing 110th Street. A collector would enter a brownstone for a pickup and never come out, the building's residents swearing he'd never been there. Policy banks would be hit, but only the Schultz-affiliated ones, never those under Bumpy's protection. Collectors would be ambushed, not killed, just humiliated and sent back downtown with messages pinned to their clothes. Each action calculated not for maximum damage, but maximum psychological impact. Over time, Harlem became a maze Dutch Schultz could not navigate. Every path led to a dead end or a missing envelope. As Schultz's frustration escalated, so did the attention from federal agents who saw in Dutch a convenient target for headlines and indictments. Bumpy's philosophy rejected the romantic notion of the gangster as a wild animal operating on instinct and rage. He called it smart violence. Never kill when humiliation would suffice. Never humiliate when a conversation would work. But when violence became necessary, make it so precise and purposeful that it served as education for everyone watching. Breaking one man's hand in front of witnesses was more effective than shooting 3 in the dark. Burning one car on a busy corner sent a wider message than torching a warehouse at midnight. He turned fear into an instrument instead of an impulse. His signature became the chess piece left on eliminated enemies, usually a black king or knight. A calling card that said this wasn't passion, this was strategy. People whispered that Bumpy never killed in anger. Anger made a man sloppy. Bumpy killed for order, for balance, for message. Violence was not expression. Violence was punctuation. The racial mathematics of his position were never far from his calculations. In 1935 America, a black man negotiating with white power structures as an equal was essentially illegal in most contexts. The Italian crime families operated within their own racial hierarchy, treating black criminals as subordinates at best, problems to be eliminated at worst. To operate as he did was an act of supreme defiance. In a country where a black man could be lynched for looking at a white woman the wrong way, Bumpy Johnson was systematically dismantling white gangsters who trespassed in his neighborhood. He existed in a space that shouldn't have been possible, commanding respect through competence so undeniable that prejudice became economically inefficient. His reputation spread beyond Harlem. Downtown crews knew his name. The commission heard reports. Stories circulated about the man who never killed in anger, only with purpose, who treated crime like a graduate-level seminar in applied power dynamics. The first contact from Luciano's people did not come as a formal invitation. It came as a question delivered through a mutual acquaintance, a man who owned a jazz club and owed favors in both directions. The message was clean and direct. Would Mr. Johnson be willing to sit down and discuss business? No threats. No posturing. Just a simple request for a meeting in neutral territory. Bumpy listened to the message in silence, his face unreadable, his eyes scanning the street for setups. He waved his men out of the back room. Only his closest lieutenant remained, a man who'd watched the Schultz War from the front lines. The request hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. He knew the history. He knew that peace treaties in the Underworld were often just preludes to massacres. Bumpy adjusted his fedora with the precise movement of a man who had survived by reading situations before they developed. His response carried the weight of someone who understood that the game had shifted into territory no one had mapped before. "When the Italians want to talk instead of fight," he said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of a professor explaining an equation, "it means they're either planning something big or they're scared of something bigger." Anthony Big Tony Strollo orchestrated his theater of disrespect with surgical precision. The corner of 116th Street offered the perfect stage, crowded enough for witnesses, public enough for maximum humiliation. When he slid that crumpled envelope across the wet newspaper stand and called Bumpy Boy, he projected his voice deliberately toward the gathering crowd. 17 people witnessed the confrontation. A shoeshine kid froze mid-polish. 2 women clutched their grocery bags until the paper split. Musicians heading into Minton's stopped to stare. A taxi driver turned his head. The racial slur hung in the spring air like a loaded weapon, obscene and calculated. Strollo wanted an audience for Bumpy's humiliation, wanted every witness to carry the story through Harlem's network of barbershops, beauty parlors, and backroom card games. Bumpy's response was more terrifying than rage. No explosion. No drawn weapon. Just that 43-second silence while he counted the insulting bills, then placed them back down like damaged goods returned to sender. When he delivered his midnight ultimatum in that judge-calm voice, some onlookers misread his restraint as defeat. They expected thunder and got a legal notice. Strollo's laughter filled the void, booming across the wet pavement as he swaggered away with his crew, convinced he had just neutered Harlem's king in front of his own subjects. The story mutated as it traveled. Within an hour, every resident between 110th and 145th Street knew the details. The barbershops dissected it, the beauty parlors analyzed every word. Policy banks buzzed with whispered conversations. The community held its collective breath, watching street corners differently, leaning closer at card tables, asking the same question in different ways. What happens now? Bumpy Johnson had built his empire on the promise of protection, on the guarantee that disrespect would be answered with consequences so severe they served as permanent education. If their protector could be publicly humiliated without response, then Harlem's shield had cracks. And once people believe their shield is broken, predators start circling. Bumpy understood the mathematics perfectly. He sat in his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, staring at the photographs of Marcus Garvey and Frederick Douglass on his wall, calculating variables that would have challenged a chess grandmaster. Respond immediately with violence and risk, destroying the unprecedented negotiation with Luciano before it began. The Italians respected cold business decisions, distrusted hot tempers. Do nothing and watch 15 years of careful empire building collapse by sunrise. The problem required a solution that demonstrated both restraint and absolute power, a message that said he could kill, but chose not to, which was infinitely more terrifying than simple murder. He made 3 phone calls. Each conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. No threats, no explanations, just simple instructions delivered in that calm, authoritative tone that made grown men check their rearview mirrors for weeks afterward. At 8:30 that evening, Anthony Strollo's gambling operations in Harlem began to suffocate without a single punch thrown. The policy banks that had been generating thousands daily suddenly had no money when collectors arrived. Runners couldn't be found. Corner stores claimed they'd never heard of gambling operations. Bumpy's network had moved through the neighborhood like antibodies attacking an infection, quietly explaining that anyone playing Strollo's numbers would find themselves permanently unwelcome at Bumpy's banks. The choice was mathematical and ruthless. Play with Strollo and watch your legitimate bets never hit again, or choose the man who paid your rent when times got hard. By nightfall, Strollo's craps games stood half empty. His policy slips stopped circulating. His dealers watched Harlem customers walk past their tables like they didn't exist. By 10:15, the second phase collapsed Strollo's protection rackets through the same systematic non-cooperation. When collectors arrived demanding their monthly envelopes, storefront owners looked them in the eye and calmly refused. "We're under Mr. Johnson's protection now." Doors closed instead of hands shaking. The logic was undeniable. Paying twice meant bankruptcy. Paying the wrong man meant damaged goods. With Bumpy's quiet assurance backing them, small businesses chose community enforcement over imported terror. Strollo's men drove through Harlem knocking on doors that wouldn't open, visiting locations stripped clean hours before their arrival. At 11:47, the personal punctuation arrived. Police officers responding to an anonymous tip found Strollo in the trunk of his own Cadillac, parked outside the 84th Precinct station house in Brooklyn. Alive, conscious, but missing 3 fingers from his right hand, the same hand that had slid the insulting envelope. The wounds had been cauterized to prevent bleeding out. His gold watch was gone. Pinned to his blood-stained shirt with a brass safety pin was a single king of spades and a note in perfect penmanship: "Harlem belongs to Harlem." Strollo refused to file charges, refused to name attackers, refused to explain what happened. He was transferred out of New York within 72 hours, reassigned to operations in New Jersey, where he would spend his remaining career in positions of steadily decreasing importance. His crew was dissolved, his men redistributed. The insult had been answered without a murder, without starting a war, without giving federal agents a body to investigate. The message traveled through the underworld faster than the original humiliation had spread through Harlem. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated something more valuable than ruthlessness. He had demonstrated control. The next morning, Bumpy woke at 7 as always, made coffee, read 3 newspapers, and waited. The phone call came at 9:15. No identification, no preamble, just a voice that carried authority without needing to announce itself. "Mr. Luciano would like to buy you dinner," the voice said simply, each word measured and deliberate. Tonight. April 15th, 1935. 8 o'clock precisely. The social club on President Street in Brooklyn existed in that gray space where legitimate business and underworld power shared the same address. No sign marked the entrance. No bouncer checked identification. The front room sold espresso and pastries to neighborhood regulars who understood not to ask questions about the back offices. This was neutral territory by design. a place where men could negotiate without the weight of their respective territories pressing down on every word. Bumpy Johnson arrived alone, wearing his best charcoal suit and the fedora that had become his trademark. No weapon under his jacket, no bodyguards waiting in cars outside. The terms had been explicit. This meeting happened between principals only, with nothing but words as weapons and reputation as currency. Inside the private room, 3 men waited at a table that could have seated 12, but tonight held only the architecture of modern organized crime. Charles Lucky Luciano sat in the center, flanked by Meyer Lonsky on his right and Frank Costello on his left. The arrangement was deliberate and calculated. Luciano as the decision-maker, Lansky as the accountant who measured every deal in dollars and cents, Costello as the diplomat who could smooth over murder with a handshake and a favor. They stood when Bumpy entered, a gesture of respect so rare in their world it carried more weight than any spoken greeting. This wasn't courtesy. This was acknowledgement. 4 chairs faced each other across polished wood. No alcohol on the table. No distractions. Just 4 men about to negotiate terms that would violate every tradition the Underworld had established over the previous 2 decades. Luciano opened without preamble, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But the words themselves transformed the dynamic completely. He didn't issue demands or establish dominance through intimidation. Instead, he presented a problem that required solving, framing the conversation as a consultation between professionals rather than a superior instructing a subordinate. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Harlem generated millions annually in policy revenue, but Italian operations there hemorrhaged money through community resistance, theft, and federal attention. Dutch Schultz's approach had failed catastrophically, turning profitable territory into a bleeding wound that drew prosecutors like sharks to blood. The Commission needed a different solution, one that acknowledged reality instead of fighting it with increasingly expensive violence. The negotiation unfolded with the precision of corporate merger discussions, each point calculated and deliberate. Territory boundaries came first, the most fundamental issue that would determine everything else. Harlem, 110th Street to 145th, river to river, would remain under Bumpy's absolute control. No Italian crews would operate policy banks, run numbers, or collect protection without his explicit approval. This wasn't tribute or temporary arrangement. This was territorial sovereignty, something no Italian boss had ever granted to a black gangster in the history of American organized crime. Profit-sharing followed, and here the conversation became mathematics rather than tradition. Luciano proposed a 60-40 split in Bumpy's favor on any operations where their interests overlapped. Lansky's objection came sharp and immediate, his accountant's mind recoiling from numbers that violated every precedent. 60% to Bumpy, 40% to the Commission, struck him as mathematical insanity. Why should the organization that controlled judges, unions, and entire industries across 5 boroughs accept minority shares in one neighborhood, regardless of how profitable that neighborhood might be? Luciano's response silenced the room and redefined the entire conversation. He leaned forward, his words measured and cold as winter mathematics. Bumpy Johnson runs Harlem better than any of our guys could. That's not opinion. That's mathematics. He laid out the numbers with brutal clarity that cut through sentiment and tradition like a blade through silk. Italian crews in Harlem had lost money consistently through community resistance, internal theft, and the kind of federal attention that turned profit into prison sentences. Every attempt to impose control through traditional methods had failed, bleeding resources and generating headlines that threatened everyone's operations. Bumpy's organization, by contrast, generated consistent profit while maintaining community stability and avoiding the chaos that invited federal investigations. The choice wasn't between 60-40 and 50-50. The choice was between 60-40 partnership or 0% of an ungovernable territory that would continue draining resources indefinitely. Operational independence became the third pillar of their arrangement. Bumpy would run his territory without interference, make his own personnel decisions, handle discipline internally according to his own methods. The Commission wouldn't micromanage or second-guess his approaches to problems they had proven incapable of solving themselves. In exchange, he would ensure that Harlem remained stable, profitable, and free from the kind of chaos that invited federal investigations. The arrangement created something unprecedented in American organized crime: a black gangster operating with commission-level autonomy, answerable to no one as long as the money flowed upward and the peace held downward. Then Luciano introduced the Dutch Schultz problem with the delicacy of a surgeon describing a necessary amputation. The Dutchman had become a liability that threatened everyone at this table: violent, unpredictable, drawing attention from Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey that could destroy the entire commission system. But commission rules prohibited eliminating a member without unanimous approval, and Schultz still maintained allies who viewed him as useful muscle rather than dangerous liability. What Luciano needed was intelligence that would make Schultz's removal appear not as internal politics, but as justified response to immediate organizational threat. Bumpy's network in Harlem had tracked Schultz's movements for months, knew his patterns, understood his vulnerabilities, documented his failures. That information, properly deployed through commission channels, could solve a problem that benefited everyone while eliminating the one man whose methods threatened to drag them all into federal courtrooms. The racial breakthrough came not as dramatic declaration, but as simple statement of operational philosophy. Luciano looked across the table with the expression of a man explaining basic arithmetic to someone who had momentarily forgotten how numbers worked. Business has no color. Only profit and loss. The words carried weight precisely because they weren't performative or political. This wasn't moral posturing or progressive ideology. This was cold recognition that prejudice was expensive, that the underworld couldn't afford the luxury of discrimination when millions of dollars demanded practical solutions over traditional hierarchies. Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem not despite being black, but because being black gave him access and authority no Italian crew could replicate or purchase. The handshake happened without ceremony or witnesses beyond the 4 men in that room. No contract signed, no lawyers present, no documentation that could later surface in federal courtrooms. Bumpy stood, extended his hand across the table, and Luciano gripped it with the firmness of someone sealing a deal worth more than money. The understanding reached that night would reshape New York's criminal landscape for decades, creating a precedent that acknowledged competence over racial hierarchy, results over tradition. A black gangster had negotiated with the Italian mob, not as a subordinate seeking permission, but as an equal partner, establishing terms that protected his interests while advancing theirs. The protection agreement that emerged was structural rather than symbolic, backed by the same enforcement mechanisms that kept the 5 families from tearing each other apart. Any Italian crew operating in Harlem without Bumpy's approval would face sanctions from the commission itself. More significantly, any threat to Bumpy Johnson would be treated as a threat to commission interests, meaning that harming him would bring down the same retaliation reserved for attacks on family bosses. The protection wasn't just about one man. It was about preserving an arrangement that generated millions in clean profit while avoiding the federal attention that traditional methods had consistently attracted. As Bumpy walked toward the door, adjusting his fedora with the precise movement of a man who had just negotiated his way into history. Luciano's voice stopped him one final time. The warning came quiet but unmistakable, delivered with the tone of someone who had survived by understanding human nature's darker mathematics and the inevitable resistance that change always provoked. "You'll be tested again," Luciano said, his eyes meeting Bumpy's with the recognition of one apex predator acknowledging another. "Count on it, by my people. By your people. By guys who don't like the idea of this deal existing. When it happens, remember, you're not just representing yourself anymore. You're representing this arrangement." The next morning, Bumpy Johnson woke up as the only black man in America that the Italian mob couldn't touch. The phone call came at 9:15, a voice that carried authority without needing to announce itself. "Mr. Luciano would like to buy you dinner tonight." October 23rd, 1935. 10:15 in the evening. The Palace Chop House in Newark became a tomb dressed as a restaurant, the air thick with the metallic scent of gunpowder and the sweeter smell of spilled blood. Dutch Schultz lay dying on the bathroom floor, his empire dissolving with every labored breath, mumbling fever dreams while doctors tried to stitch together what bullets had torn apart. The assassination was sanctioned by the Commission, executed by Murder, Inc. But the intelligence that made it surgical rather than sloppy had flowed upward from Harlem through channels that kept Bumpy Johnson's involvement invisible. Schultz's patterns, his safe houses, his trusted locations, his moments of vulnerability, all documented with the precision of a doctoral thesis and delivered through intermediaries who understood that some favors were worth more than money. The Dutchman died never knowing that the black gangster he'd tried to crush had provided the roadmap for his elimination. The power vacuum opened like a wound, and into it rushed the inevitable stupidity of ambitious men who mistook opportunity for invitation. Lower-level Italian crews, hungry and disconnected from commission-level thinking, saw Harlem as suddenly available territory. These weren't bosses who understood the new arrangement. These were street soldiers who knew only the old mathematics, where black neighborhoods existed to be exploited, and black gangsters existed to be subordinated or eliminated. They moved into Harlem with the confidence of men who believed tradition would protect them, unaware that the architecture of power had been fundamentally redesigned 6 months earlier in a Brooklyn social club. The first violation came from a Genovese-affiliated crew that established policy operations on 125th Street without consultation or permission. They rented a storefront, hired local runners with threats and cash, and began taking bets with the assumption that Italian surnames carried more weight than community loyalty. For 72 hours, they operated openly, collecting money and building what they imagined would become permanent foothold. On Thursday morning, they arrived at their cash house to find it surgically empty. Not robbed in the traditional sense, no broken locks, no signs of forced entry, just systematic removal of every dollar, every betting slip, every piece of documentation. The safe had been opened with the combination, not blown apart. Worse than the missing money were the missing ledgers, the ones documenting kickbacks to corrupt police captains and skimming from their own downtown bosses. Those ledgers arrived anonymously at the Internal Revenue Service field office in Lower Manhattan, complete with addresses and operational details that would keep federal investigators busy for months. The crew found themselves facing not street justice but tax evasion charges, the kind of legal nightmare that could dismantle entire organizations. Pinned to the empty safe was a king of spades and a note written in perfect penmanship. Tax day came early. The second lesson targeted arrogance directly. A young Italian hothead, barely 23, and convinced his family connections made him bulletproof, slapped an elderly Harlem numbers runner on Lenox Avenue for arriving $5 short on his collection. The runner had been delayed by a police shakedown the Italian knew nothing about. The slap was meant to establish dominance, to remind witnesses that Italian authority superseded local arrangements. The racial slur that followed made it personal. 24 hours later, that hothead was found hanging upside down from a fire escape on 132nd Street, alive but stripped to his underwear, his expensive suit shredded and stuffed in his mouth. His face bore no permanent damage, but the humiliation was total and public. Dozens of residents watched from windows as police cut him down, his screaming protests about respect and family name only deepening his shame. A sign hung around his neck read, "I forgot my manners," in the same perfect penmanship. His pockets were stuffed with $5 bills, the exact amount he had demanded. He left New York within a week, reassigned to West Coast operations where the story wouldn't follow him quite so loudly. The third incident sealed the new order. A Brooklyn crew attempted to muscle into protection rackets along the Harlem waterfront, demanding payments from dock workers and warehouse operators who had been under Bumpy's protection for years. They arrived with baseball bats and confident threats, unaware they were walking into territory that had been marked and measured months earlier. The crew's cars were found the next morning, parked in a neat row outside their own social club in Brooklyn, completely stripped. No tires, no engines, no seats, just hollow metal shells sitting on blocks like picked clean carcasses. Inside each vehicle was a king of spades and a note. "Harlem is not for sale. This is your only warning." Frank Costello understood the pattern immediately. 3 incidents in rapid succession, executed without a single homicide, each ending with the same calling card, meant something bigger than random retaliation. It meant systematic enforcement by someone who operated with commission-level precision. Costello drove to Harlem personally, without advance notice or security detail, and found Bumpy at a corner table in Small's Paradise, drinking coffee and reading racing forms like a man without a care in the world. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Costello delivered a formal apology on behalf of the commission for the violations, acknowledged that the crews had acted without authorization, and assured Bumpy that the message had been received at the highest levels. More significantly, he confirmed what the incidents had already proven. Any future violations would be treated as attacks on the organization itself. The new order established itself through whispered conversations in social clubs across the 5 boroughs. Italian crews planning Harlem operations began checking with Bumpy first, treating him not as a local operator who needed consultation, but as a commission-level authority whose approval was mandatory. The phone calls came respectfully, the requests properly framed, the tone carefully calibrated to acknowledge his position. 3 months later, in a smoky back room in Brooklyn, a young Italian mobster made the mistake of questioning the arrangement out loud. His capo, a man who had survived 2 decades by understanding when rules changed and why, delivered the answer with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a slow student. "Why do we have to ask permission from a colored guy?" the young soldier asked, his voice carrying casual racism that had been standard procedure for generations. The capo's response came cold and final, because Luciano said so. And when Luciano says a man is untouchable, he stays untouchable. The 1940s arrived with the arrangement, no longer experimental, but hardened into institutional doctrine. What began as a quiet understanding in a Brooklyn social club had become standard operating procedure across all 5 families, written into the unspoken constitution of New York's Underworld. Young Italian soldiers learning the life received the lesson alongside warnings about testifying and rules about civilian casualties. Harlem belongs to Bumpy Johnson, and touching him means war with the commission itself. The deal survived personnel changes, family disputes, and the inevitable churn of criminal enterprise, because it generated consistent profit while maintaining the kind of stability that kept federal investigators focused elsewhere. In 1946, federal authorities deported Lucky Luciano to Italy on manufactured prostitution charges, removing the architect of the modern commission system. Many expected Bumpy's protection to evaporate with Luciano's exile, assuming the arrangement had been personal rather than structural. They were catastrophically wrong. The deal survived precisely because it had never been about sentiment or individual loyalty. It was mathematics, cold and undeniable. Harlem continued generating millions in clean profit. Bumpy continued maintaining order without federal attention. The five families continued receiving their shares without the chaos that had plagued Dutch Schultz's failed operations. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, men who agreed on almost nothing else, agreed on this: the arrangement was profitable. And profitable arrangements didn't require their architects to remain present. The protection proved itself real and substantial in ways that transcended symbolic gestures. In 1948, when a corrupt police captain attempted to shake down Bumpy's policy operations for triple the usual tribute, Frank Costello made a phone call that had the captain transferred to Staten Island traffic duty within 72 hours. In 1952, when a Chicago crew tried to establish loan sharking operations in Harlem without authorization, Vito Genovese personally intervened to shut them down and deliver an apology that came with imported wine and assurances it wouldn't happen again. In 1956, when federal agents began investigating Bumpy's operations with unusual intensity, Carlo Gambino used his political connections to redirect that attention toward less protected targets. These weren't favors. They were enforcement of contractual obligations, the commission protecting its investment with the same efficiency it used to protect its own family bosses. Under Bumpy's rule, Harlem experienced something approaching stability, a paradoxical peace enforced by a man who built his reputation on strategic violence. The numbers racket operated like a regulated utility rather than chaotic free-for-all. Policy banks opened and closed on schedule. Winners received their payouts without argument. Runners who skimmed faced consequences, but honest workers earned steady income and protection from outside predators. Abusive landlords found themselves suddenly unable to collect rent from tenants under Bumpy's protection. Loan sharks who charged predatory rates discovered their operations shut down overnight. The violence that did occur was surgical and purposeful, designed to maintain order rather than create chaos. The younger generation of Italian mobsters grew up in a world where Bumpy Johnson's untouchable status was simply accepted reality, like gravity or compound interest. Soldiers initiated in the 1950s never knew a time when Italian crews could operate freely in Harlem. They learned the boundaries before they learned to make their first collection, absorbed the lesson that some territories required permission and some men commanded respect regardless of racial hierarchies. When they rose to positions of authority, they passed down the same institutional knowledge. Bumpy Johnson is off limits. Harlem requires consultation. Violating this arrangement brings consequences from the top. The contradiction at the heart of Bumpy's position never fully resolved itself. He existed in partnership with Italian families that practiced the same racial discrimination that defined American society. These were organizations that wouldn't allow black members, wouldn't socialize with black civilians, yet treated Bumpy Johnson as an equal in business matters and protected his interests with commission-level authority. They could respect his competence while maintaining racist beliefs about black people generally. The Underworld operated on its own logic, where profit and power trumped ideology. The 1960s brought seismic shifts that made Bumpy's position even more remarkable. While Martin Luther King Jr. marched and Malcolm X preached, Bumpy Johnson operated in the shadows, representing an older form of resistance built on economic leverage and strategic violence. As the civil rights movement challenged every assumption about racial hierarchy, a black gangster who had negotiated as an equal with white organized crime for 3 decades became a walking contradiction to everything both sides claimed about race and power. July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street. Bumpy Johnson suffered a massive heart attack while eating breakfast, collapsing at his usual corner table where he had conducted business for decades. He was 62 years old, having outlasted most of his Italian contemporaries through strategic intelligence, community protection, and the arrangement that made him too valuable to eliminate and too dangerous to challenge. His funeral drew a crowd that would have been impossible to imagine in any other context. Thousands of Harlem residents lined the streets, mourning the man who had paid their rent and enforced order when the legal system provided only neglect. But mixed among them were Italian mobsters in expensive suits, family representatives who came not out of sentiment, but out of respect for an arrangement that had generated decades of profit and stability. The gathering represented something unprecedented. A black gangster receiving the same funeral honors typically reserved for commission bosses. In a city built on power and prejudice, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson became the only man who made the rules bend to respect him. The deal with Lucky Luciano wasn't just about territory or money. It was about something more valuable in the underworld: recognition. And once earned through strategic violence, community investment, and decades of profitable operations, that recognition became untouchable.